There we go. Hang on, let me just bring Teams up again so I can see. There wasn't anything interesting on that first screen other than the introductory slide. So just for completeness, there we go. But yeah, so we're both active on Twitter. So again, I don't want to put words into Nikola's mouth, but any questions about any of this, please reach out. Nikola blogs at Data Mozart, and I'm at serverlessSQL.com. I'll do a couple of slides and then I'll hand over to Nikola to carry on. But so we've got a certification that went into beta April last year, so 2022, 3 months until it came out of beta. So it was around May, June time. So reasonably new. Okay, so it's still very new. It's not even had its first birthday yet, and it occupies the space between data engineering and data analysis. Yeah, so we joked earlier about the space that analytics engineering occupies between a data analyst and report builder and a fully fledged data engineering. Well, this is essentially Microsoft's version of that. A little bit of Power BI, a little bit of Synapse, a little bit of data governance, but giving you the ability to understand how those services work with each other and some of the independent features of those services as well. So, like an amazing certification, really. It's probably the first certification that I've been excited about. So, just to bring up a couple of changes. So, February the 6th, 2 or 3 days ago, if you take the exam, well, from now onwards, there's really only 2 things that's changed. They've changed the naming convention from Azure Purview to Microsoft Purview. I'm not sure it's going to trip you up too much, but worth calling out. The other thing which is worth calling out is that in the Optimize enterprise scale data models, they've appended to the implement incremental refresh skill, including the use of query folding. So having an understanding of query folding, Microsoft are testing for that as well. Now, I know that Nikola's blogged extensively about query folding, so you've got all the information that you need from there.
Yes, perhaps short for everyone, just explain what query folding is in 2 sentences.
Query folding, the ability to push the transformation logic down to the data source itself. So instead, I mean, Power BI is amazing, right? I mean, it can do loads of things. It can transform into just about anything you need. But sometimes it's actually worthwhile that those transformations happen down in the source. It's Rocher's maxim, right? Do all your transformation as far upstream as possible. And of course, if you're using Synapse Analytics, why not use the power of Synapse to do your transformations, and then let Power BI do what it does best, without having to go through loads and loads and loads of steps of trimming, doing transformations that can be done in the data source. So yeah, well worth calling out there, Brian. Thank you.
Sure.
So in terms of the candidate profile, what I'm going to do is, because we want to skip to the content, so in terms of responsibilities, yes, you're looking at cleaning and transforming data. This rather nebulous term of building enterprise data models, and I think Nikola will kind of call out what that means in terms of large models within Power BI. And the people that are sitting this certification or looking to do this certification, yeah, it's about optimizing some of that performance between Power BI and Synapse. So understanding what features in Power BI and Synapse work very well and how to optimize those features as well. Now, what the candidates should have, I mean, I am pulling this verbatim from what Microsoft have said. So I don't believe that you need advanced Power BI skills, because that covers such a broad area, right? So for example, I'd say advanced Power BI skills would be understanding all the visualizations that are available. That's the PL300. That's the data analyst certification. there's a little DAX, small amount of DAX, but I wouldn't say there's a lot. And you know, yes, so it's sitting on the kind of data modeling side of Power BI, I think. So in terms of the skills measured, the breakdown, we've got 4 distinct categories. So yes, we've got some data governance in that first category about implementing and, you know, managing an environment. The query and transform data, that's all about how you connect to and use the various SQL pools in Synapse. Got some large data model and some settings within the implementing, and then there is some visualization aspects both in Power BI and in Synapse itself. So we'll go through that as well. So in total, there's 49 individual line items. So that hasn't changed in the latest version that they've published, which, you know, has a couple of tweaks. So in terms of the data platform services, you can almost create an architectural diagram with what's available. Yes, we've got Power BI right in the middle. We've got Synapse. We've got a little bit of DevOps. We've got some Purview for data governance, Data Lake Gen 2, and some of the external tools as well. So actually, I love this certification because it covers lots of these services, and with just enough detail, just enough of those services to allow them all to work together as well. So you're not going to have to know each of those services like deep dive, which is really great, really great. I love it from a learning perspective. So Nikola, shall I hand over to you to carry on the rest of the introduction, and then go, I think the first lot is around Power BI.
No, first is Purview.
Is it Purview?
Yeah.
It's me.
Yeah.
Perhaps we can help Christopher. He has a question here. Years of experience working with Power BI and or Synapse and or Purview. Recommended to even consider getting the DP-500?
Yeah, I can answer, Andy, if you agree.
Go for it.
So for Power BI, I would say you definitely need a few years of experience, because it doesn't cover basic topics which are part of PL300. So I always, whenever I am being asked about this, I always advise go first for PL300 to get this basic knowledge, and then move to DP-500 in terms of intermediate to advanced Power BI topics. For Synapse and Purview, Synapse is a relatively new product, but it consists of some products that are longer being here. So it's like an umbrella for all the products. So in this exam, I would say you don't need many years of experience using those products, but it will obviously help if you used to work with, let's say, traditional databases, SQL Server and stuff like that, because in the end, dedicated SQL and serverless SQL require knowledge of T-SQL coding. And for Purview, it's also a relatively new product, I would say. So again, and not implemented in many organizations. And finally, it's not a big part of the exam. Guys, please correct me if I told something wrong, but that's just my opinion.
Yeah, I totally agree. And if you need a technical certification on Synapse, I would go to the DP-203 instead. And Purview or is that a part of the security part of Azure in Microsoft terms for certifications? I can't remember. Sorry.
I don't think so.
No, I think the DP-500 might be the only one at the moment. Probably the security compliance aspect of Purview is probably in the certifications. The Purview that we know in terms of being able to scan data assets and catalog them, as far as I know, it's only in the DP-500 so far.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But yeah, sorry, I didn't want to take up too much of the introduction. So I don't know whether Nikola, you want to talk through the next couple of slides until we get to Purview.
Sure. So let me just then quickly share my screen. I'll take over from you, Andy. And hopefully you can see it now. So the slide that you just shown describes different roles in terms of data space within the organization, and we are talking about enterprise systems, so not small businesses where probably there is one person playing multiple of these roles. And you see that this one in the middle, Azure Enterprise Data Analyst, which is focus of our today's session, is a little bit of everything. So the person who is behind this title, Azure Enterprise Data Analyst, he has to know a little bit about data engineering stuff. So how data comes into the data model, into the storage, and so on. It also needs to collaborate with other data personas in organization like data scientists, AI engineers, also with DBAs, solution architects, and finally, of course, with Power BI data analysts. So this enterprise data analyst should have at least basic understanding of each of these of the tasks and roles that are performed by those other roles that are part of enterprise grade environments. So in this session, we will talk about all the topics that are part of the exam. We'll kick it off by explaining what is Microsoft Purview and how it works in synergy with how it integrates with Synapse and Power BI. Then we'll also cover some of the Power BI topics, and obviously we'll talk also about Synapse Analytics, and we will spend some time explaining external tools. I was both surprised and happy that Microsoft included external tools as part of this exam, because let's be honest and let's admit that if you're working with enterprise data models, you should definitely use some of these external tools that we will cover today. And that being said, Andy, handing back over to you if that's okay for Purview part.
Brilliant. Yeah, so we're going to our first section, which is about Purview. Now, as I said previously, you're not going to have to know every single aspect of Purview. Purview has now got quite a lot of different functionality within it. And we're concentrating in this exam on two parts, which is the data map and the data catalog. Okay, so in terms of the way that Purview integrates with Power BI, for example, it's around scanning and cataloging the assets available within a Power BI tenant. Now, at the moment, we've got dashboards, reports, data sets, and data flows that are available as assets that will be scanned by Purview and incorporated within the data catalog. Okay, and what Purview will do is it will create some lineage, so you will be able to see which dashboard is being fed from which reports, which data set is feeding which reports, and where those data sets get their data from. So in the example here, the red writing is just me overlaying, but actually you can see the journey from the data source itself, which is in this case an Azure SQL database, through a data flow to a data set, a report, and a dashboard. Okay, so understanding what Power BI items will be included in a Purview scan is important there. Now, when we're using the two features in Purview, the data map and the data catalog, what the data map allows you to do is create this kind of topology called collections. And collections allow you to group your data assets. So this is actually a business function, really. So within your organization, you might want to group your assets by department, by region, by function, however you want to do that. The collections is where you do it, and the data map is where you do it there. But it's also the place that you connect to and initiate an actual scan. Yeah. So the data map is all about connecting to and cataloging your assets, whereas the catalog is about viewing the assets. and editing some of that metadata. So in the catalog, you can browse the assets. Now you can browse them by the type that they are. So you can go in and see just Power BI assets, or just SQL assets, or data lake assets, but also by the collection. So if the topology of your collection is based on department, you could maybe search what's available in a department by going specifically into that collection. So really, the data catalog is for viewing the metadata around your data assets. The data map is about collecting those data assets together. So I think we're over to Nikola now on the Power BI side of things.
Yeah, thank you. So this is just a high-level overview of 4 subtopics in Power BI that we are going to cover in this session. And before I proceed, just to tell you that obviously this session will not get you ready for passing the exam, because we probably need a few hours or a few full days of training to cover all the skills and concepts. But the goal is to provide you with a high-level overview of these essential tools, essential concepts, essential skills that are part of the exam, so then you can focus on learning those things instead of wasting time on maybe some less important stuff. So let's kick it off by explaining composite models. And first of all, if you're working with Power BI and if you're talking with other Power BI professionals, you will maybe hear them talking about 2 different composite model types. Don't be afraid and don't be surprised if you hear something like that. So let's quickly try to draw the line between these 2 types of composite models. First one is the traditional one, composite model feature that lets you combine data coming from 2 different direct query data sources. Meaning, let's say I'm using direct query to a SQL Server database and I'm using direct query to Oracle database. So those are 2 different direct query sources, and that model is treated as composite model. Also combining 1 or more direct query data sources with import mode, that's also composite model. If you hear something else, composite models, Gen 2, version 2, and so on, that's not an official name for this feature. The official name, at least at this moment, we don't know, because it's still in public preview. If we don't know if this feature will be called the same once it goes to general availability, is direct query for Power BI datasets and Azure Analysis services. This version of composite models is more sophisticated. It lets you connect to a published Power BI dataset and use this in combination with other direct query and or import mode data. Mind-blowing, so it's not part of the exam. So I just wanted for you to be sure that to make distinction between those 2 types. So what are essentially composite models? In dark ages of Power BI, so a few years back, I think before 2018, if you wanted to use direct query as a source for your report, so once you've chosen direct query for a certain data source, let's say SQL Server, the possibility to extend on this was gone. So to put it simple, you couldn't combine a direct query over 1 data source like SQL Server with a direct query over another data source, like in this example you see on your screens, where other data comes from Oracle database. Let alone combining direct query with import mode. That was completely science fiction. So luckily these times are now behind us, and we can create a data model like this one you see in this illustration. For example, data coming from Excel file which is stored on your local PC. Then imported data from SQL Server table. Then direct query over data from that retrieves data from another SQL Server instance. And finally, direct query that retrieves the data from Oracle database table. The important thing to keep in mind here is that all imported data sources, so it doesn't matter if it's Excel file, if it's SQL Server table, whatever it is, all imported data sources are being treated as one single artifact from Power BI perspective, because the data will be stored in the local instance of analysis services that Power BI uses to store imported data. So from composite model perspective, that's one source. In this illustration, we have two direct query source groups. One is SQL Server, one is Oracle, and we have this import mode source group. The power of composite models basically is that now you can establish relationships between data stored in Vertipack, which is imported data, and data that lives somewhere outside of Power BI. Now, if you're wondering why some of the arrows on this illustration are dashed and the others are not, that's a great question, I would say. Those arrows represent relationships between the tables in different storage environments. So tabular model supports two types of relationships, regular and limited. You will probably hear sometimes strong and weak relationships. Those are terms that were used previously. Now it's regular and limited. Obviously, explaining behavior and limitations of limited relationships is out of the scope of today's session, but they come with many potential downsides and many potential considerations. So to cut the story short, try to avoid limited relationships whenever possible. So to conclude this story about composite models, you should keep in mind two things. First, you can create relationships between the data coming from different storage mode sources. And number two, you must be aware of the behavior of these relationships, meaning regular versus limited relationships. Next feature that I would like to cover is aggregations. Again, like with composite models, we have two types of aggregations in Power BI, user-defined aggregations and automatic aggregations. User-defined aggregations are here for a long time, and with user-defined aggregations, as their name suggests, you are in charge of defining and managing aggregations, even though Power BI later automatically identifies aggregations when executing the query. Automatic aggregations are one of the newer features in Power BI. So with them in place, you just need to turn this option on in your Power BI tenant. Then you can sit, relax, grab a coffee, and some machine learning algorithms in behind will collect the data about most frequently running queries in your reports and will automatically generate aggregations to support those queries. In the exam, only user-defined aggregations are covered, so we will focus on explaining how user-defined aggregations work. The important thing is that it's not enough to create just aggregated tables. I had a case a few months ago at one client where they created aggregated tables. They connected those aggregated tables like fact tables with dimension tables. They put everything in place, but they didn't define aggregations on the Power BI level itself. So always make sure that you make Power BI aware of these aggregations, so Power BI can internally map your queries from direct query detail table, which is usually huge, to those smaller aggregated tables. This is a simplified illustration how aggregations could be configured within your data model. This is this option, manage aggregations, where you are basically making Power BI aware that you are that you want to use aggregated tables in the data model. Those tables with dashed blue lines on the top, those are dimension tables, and recommended practice when you are creating a composite model with aggregations in place is to store, so original table must be in direct query storage mode. If it's not in direct query storage mode, aggregations will not work. So that's important thing to keep in mind. Original detail table should always be in direct query storage mode. Dimension tables should use dual storage mode. I will explain why. And those smaller aggregated tables should be in import mode. That doesn't necessarily mean that they must be in import mode. So you can also use direct query mode for them, but it's recommended to get the full benefit of having data stored within the Vertipack in cache memory. It's recommended practice to use import mode for aggregated tables. Dimension tables should use dual mode. That means that data from those tables is imported into Power BI, but it also stays in the data source, in the original data source. And then depending during the query execution, if Power BI takes data from direct query detail table, so going outside of Power BI, then dimension tables will behave like direct query storage mode. If Power BI retrieves the data from aggregated tables which are in import mode, then dimension tables will behave like they're in import mode. Why is that important? Because by setting their storage mode to dual, we are basically avoiding to have limited relationships that I mentioned previously. So we have regular relationships with all their benefits, and that's the idea why we should store the data in dimension tables in dual storage mode. Next thing, very important, DAX variables and how to handle blanks in DAX. So as a DAX beginner, it's easy to fall into the trap thinking that you don't need variables. You know, why would I care about the variables when my DAX formulas consists of, 2-3 lines of code? However, as time goes by and you start writing, so you become more and more proficient with DAX and you write more complex calculations, you will start to appreciate the concept of using variables in DAX. And when I say more complex calculations, I mean using nested functions and possible reusing of the expression logic. Also, in many cases, variables may significantly improve the performance of your calculation because the expression will be evaluated by the engine only once instead of multiple times. And final reason for using variables is that they enable you to easier debug the code. It's more readable and you can easily verify results for the certain parts of your formula. I put it on the screen, one very simple example of using variables in DAX code. When you're talking about handling blanks, there are multiple ways to handle blanks in DAX. Two most common that I know is using an if statement and then checking if the certain expression evaluates to blank. Depending on the result, you may decide what to put instead of blank. You can also use a more elegant solution with coalesce function. For those coming from SQL background, I assume that you are familiar. This is a well-known function in SQL, but let's briefly explain for those who are not familiar with it how it works in DAX. So basically, coalesce function will walk through the values that you passed as an arguments, and then they will the coalesce function will return the first non-blank value. However, and this is important, be very careful when you decide to replace blanks with explicit values in your DAX formulas, because that can neglect the engine's capability to include the non-empty implicit filter, which essentially excludes the rows where there are no matching records. So once you replace blank with some explicit value, usually that's number 0, you will get a full cross-join query of dimension tables, which can potentially decrease the query performance. Not always, depending which visual type you use and how many rows you need to display in that visual, but be careful when you're using blanks. Okay, so Brian and Andy spoiled my party for query folding today. I'm happy that, no worries, yeah, just kidding. I'm happy that Andy and I decided to include query folding in our presentation, even though before it officially became part of the exam. Because personally, I think it's so important feature that, yeah, I was really surprised that it was not part of the exam until a few days ago. So I will not waste time repeating what Brian and Andy already perfectly explained. What is a query folding? Essentially, it's a capability of the mashup engine to translate M language of Power Query to a query language that data source will understand. Obviously, in most cases, we are talking about SQL databases, but there are also some other data sources that support query folding. What's the idea? Again, Roche's maxim, those robust relational database management systems are built to cope with huge amounts of data in most optimal way. So by pushing this heavy lifting to the data source, we can reduce the workload that is needed to be performed by Power BI. And this definition of query folding is basically that ability to generate a single SQL query. That's important to remember. It's always a single SQL query. So it's not a series of SQL queries. It's just a single SQL query that's going to be executed on the data source side. So nevertheless, if you have 2 transformations in Power Query or 22, if the engine is able to generate a single SQL query, then we say that this query is folding. So why should you care about query folding? First of all, your data refresh process will be more efficient, both in terms of refresh speed and resources consumption. Then if you're working with direct query or dual storage mode that we mentioned previously with aggregations, your query, because you are targeting a SQL database directly, as its name says, direct query, all your transformations must fold or your solution will not work. Simple as that. And finally, incremental refresh. That's where Microsoft included concept of query folding. Why? Because it's of key importance for incremental refresh process. So once Power BI determines that there is no query folding in place, it will warn you that there is no query folding. So it will not break your incremental refresh, but you will get this warning above. So why is it important for incremental refresh? Because if there is no query folding, so Power BI can't generate SQL query that will pull only this data that is part of this incremental refresh partition. All the data will be pulled from the SQL source database, and then all your Power Query transformations will be applied. So you are basically losing the benefit of having incremental refresh in place. One more thing to keep in mind, if your report is slow, or your visuals need a lot of time to render, or your data model size is large, don't blame query folding for that. So it's not because of query folding. Only if your data refresh or incremental refresh processes are slow, you should investigate your Power Query steps in more depth and try to figure out if the query folds or not. Few more things to keep in mind regarding query folding. It's not all or nothing process. That's also very important to understand. So if you have something like this and your query folds up until 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th step, you will still get some benefits from partial query folding. But once the query folding is broken, it can't be achieved anymore. So this part here below the step that breaks the query folding will not be translated to SQL, even though you have some of the transformations that should be foldable. They will not be pushed to a SQL Server database. So if you have a step that breaks the query folding and you need to leave it in your transformation pipeline, the idea is then to move it down below this transformation pipeline as much as possible. So push it down as a last step or something like that. Okay, now let's talk about direct query storage modes. One of my favorite topics. So direct query, I saw a lot of cases where people thought that by switching from import mode to direct query, they will improve the performance of the Power BI report. The explanation is, we have a very strong database in the background, so it will run faster than it will run in import mode in Power BI. That's one of the biggest fallacies. So direct query versus import mode. No chance that direct query will ever be faster and more performant than import storage mode when data is stored in cache memory. No chance. Therefore, direct query should be your option only when pure import mode is not an option, for just those 3 cases that you see on your screen. So just in those 3 cases, go this way and use direct query. First, data is too large for import mode. So if you're working with Pro license in Power BI, that limit is 1 GB per dataset. If you're working with premium capacity and you enable this large dataset format, I think in 99.99% of cases, you don't have to worry about data model size. It goes to, I think, 400 gigabytes. I'm not sure, need to check, but I think it goes to 400 gigabytes. Then the second excuse for using direct query, and it's a valid one, I have to admit, is when you have real-time reporting requirements, meaning your users need to see data in Power BI report with, let's say, 2 minutes latency. So obviously you can't refresh the data every 2 minutes. It's not possible. So in those cases, direct queries is obvious choice, but still don't fall into this trap so easy. Talk to your users and ask them, is it really necessary to have real-time data in their Power BI reports? And just one trivia, so whenever I ask users, what does real-time mean for you, I'm getting like 20 different answers. For I got the answer that real-time data is every morning when I come to my office and turn on my PC and go to Power BI, I want to have the latest data every morning. So that's every morning. That's real-time data. For others, that was 2 times a day, in the morning and before they leave the office. So for those cases, you can easily use import mode and then just refresh the data once per day, twice per day, up to 48 times per day if you have premium. So talk to your users and ask them and explain them all the possible downsides of using direct query storage mode. And in many cases, they will agree that maybe they don't need data with 1 minute latency. And finally, third reason is when security policies are defined on the data source side, because in those cases, report users' credentials will be propagated directly to a data source, and all those security rules will be applied there. So those are 3 cases when you should use direct query. Now we are slowly moving to another topic of Power BI, which is related to licensing. And this one is also very confusing for many new users in Power BI and many companies that are considering starting using Power BI. So they're not sure what are the options when it comes to licensing. So what I like to do in those cases is first, I tell them there are 2 types of licenses in Power BI. One is based on user, the other is based on capacity. So in this case, when we are talking about licenses per user, we have a free license, obviously. So everyone can download Power BI Desktop for free, develop reports, use all the features that exist in Power BI within the Power BI Desktop. But once they want to deploy this report, there is a problem, because you can publish this report only to a place called My Workspace. And as its name suggests, it's my workspace. So that's my sandbox, personal playground. So no one else can access content from this My Workspace. So it's not a recommended way of doing things in organizations, especially in huge organizations. Then we have 2 paid licenses per user. We have a pro license, which comes at a cost of $10, at this moment at least, at $10 per month per user. And we have a premium per user, which costs double of that. So you can either use add-on on your pro license, or you can pay $20 per month per user, and then you get most of the premium features on a user level. Then we have 2 different types of capacity licenses. First one is when your organization, so when we are talking about capacity licensing, we are talking about what organizations pay basically for Power BI. So first case is that organization doesn't pay anything. So it's a shared capacity. That means that this capacity is shared between your organization and other organizations that are not paying. And we have paid version, which is called premium. And depending on the capacity features, number of cores, power of CPU, and so on, it starts from around $5,000 per month. It's P1 premium capacity. They also come with in flavor of embedded, and also with from P1 to P6. I think P6 is the the biggest one and the most powerful when it comes to premium capacity. And basically we are using capacity to assign content to it. That means, because we are talking about organizations, in order for other members of that organization to access the content created by Power BI developers, they need to have access to a capacity, either through shared capacity or premium capacity. And because I touched upon this topic of sharing in Power BI and how different users within the organization can consume the Power BI content, this table is very important, and especially those three cells which states no. So those are the license types that can view or access the content depending who created that content. First of all, if you are working on a shared capacity, Power BI developers, so people who are developing and publishing Power BI reports, they always need to have at least Pro license. If you're a report consumer and your organization is paying premium capacity, then you don't need any kind of license to access this content. So your company is already paying for you. So we will share this presentation, and I encourage you to keep in mind this table, what is possible and who can see what with which type of license. It requires a lot of time to explain all the possible combinations, but yeah, just keep in mind that with premium capacity, for example, as a report consumer, you don't need any kind of license. So to conclude this story about licensing and sharing, premium capacity makes sense for a large number of consumers. So if you have if you're part of the organization that has, let's say, more than 300 report consumers, it makes sense to consider paying for premium capacity. Other than that, Pro license will cover most of the cases that you need, unless you need really some premium features. Premium capacity makes sense for very large data models. So if your data models start to grow close to 1 gigabyte or more than 1 gigabyte, then you need to have premium capacity or premium per user, depending on your specific use case and the number of users of Power BI within the organization. So premium per user makes sense for smaller number of users that need premium features. I'll give you a simple example. Deployment pipelines, that's premium only feature at this moment. And let's say that you have like 50 users in your company, 50 Power BI users. So instead of paying $5,000 per month to have deployment pipelines, you can buy 50 premium per user licenses that will cost you $1,000 per month. So 5 times less than the premium capacity. And then you can use deployment pipelines included in this premium per user license. Next topic, creating reusable assets.
Can I interrupt you, Nikola?
Sure.
Before we get too far away from it, because Camilo has a question around the ideal scenario would be to use a hybrid. I think this relates to the import/direct query mode. So most data to be imported, but only direct query what changes often. And I think we got a blog post from one of you guys. I think it was 2 days ago about the poor man's hybrid model.
Yeah. So that's a fair point. Great point. Essentially, the only problem with hybrid tables that they're premium feature only at this moment. So I wrote a blog post that is called Power BI Hybrid Tables for Poor People, where you can mimic somehow. So it's not a hybrid table, definitely, but you can mimic the behavior of hybrid tables, even though if you're using a Pro license. But great point. Yeah, the hybrid mode is basically gets you best from both worlds. So you have import mode for older data and direct query mode for most recent data. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. So regarding creating reusable assets, I wanted to make the distinction between those three. PBIX, the main thing that we in most cases we are developing, and this PBIX file contains connections, datasets, transformations, visualizations, everything, including the real data. We have then PBIT, so if you want to save your Power BI report as a PBIT. This is Power BI template file. So it contains everything the same like PBIX except the data. So it contains only metadata, data model, report pages, stuff like that, but not the real data, which you will see if you compare the same file stored as PBIX and PBIT. Usually PBIT is very small. It's a tiny fraction from PBIX memory size. And finally, PBIDS, data source, basically that saves only the link to a data source. Before I hand over to Andy, I think I have only deployment pipelines to cover. That's a Power BI object that exists, let's say, a kind of separately from other objects in Power BI ecosystem. And another proof is that permissions for deployment pipelines are managed separately from workspace permissions. So what happens when you create deployment pipelines? You're implementing CI/CD rules for your Power BI deployment, and you can configure different rules based on parameter to configure and to customize how this deployment pipeline process will look like. And also, what is very important, especially in those huge organizations, is integration with Azure DevOps and REST APIs. So there is an option out of the box to automate your Power BI deployment pipelines using, for example, Azure DevOps. Most of the companies are implementing that solution. Also keep in mind, same as for hybrid tables, deployment pipelines are at this moment, I always need to say this at this moment, because we were talking about paginated reports up until 1 month ago as premium only features. So I need to add this disclaimer. At this moment, deployment pipelines are premium only feature. So if you're working on pro license, no deployment pipelines. Designing for accessibility. That's another very important and very, I would say, relevant topic nowadays. Why is this important? Because essentially, as you may know, the same report may look very different across different devices. So if I create a Power BI report and look at this report from my desktop, it looks completely different than if I'm using, for example, tablet or mobile phone. Similar logic applies to different persons. You have to keep in mind that your users might have some visual impairments. Maybe this is too harsh, sorry for this, using this normal description, it's not a good one, but I would say if you are a person without any visual impairments, this picture on the left, this nice balloon flying over green fields, is how you will see this picture. But if you're, for example, diagnosed with deuteranopia, which is a medical name for green blindness, this same picture looks completely different. I think we can agree on that. And that's why it is important to design your report, Power BI report, with as many users in your mind as possible. Luckily, Power BI offers you a whole range of different features, and most of them are available out of the box. Some of them, those on the left-hand side, built-in features, they don't even require additional configuration. So it's based on your Windows settings and stuff like that. Also, there are some of them that are configurable, like alt text, tab order. Then also make sure that your labels and titles are clear and don't cause confusion. Use markers. Carefully choose your themes for Power BI report. Think about contrast between the report elements. Think about which colors you are using, and also don't use colors to provide important information to your users. I'm handing over now to Andy for Synapse part.
Brilliant, thanks, Nikola. I will just adjust my teams again. So yes, now we're on to Synapse Analytics. Now, I think, as we said earlier in the exam, this is not about data engineering with Synapse. So if you're on the Power BI side and you're not really too sure about Synapse Analytics, you're not going to be expected to be a data engineer in the world of Synapse, but you will be expected to understand the options in terms of the SQL pools, which we're going to go through, plus a few of the integration points with Synapse as well. So it's more about reading the data from Synapse and understanding which service will be used in which scenario, rather than having to understand any heavy data engineering. So we're going to go through integrating Power BI into Synapse, the two SQL pools. We've got dedicated and serverless. Serverless, we're looking at querying data external, so we'll have a look at that. But we can also query complex data, so nested JSON data. So we're going to look at some of the functions that you'll be expected to at least have a general understanding of which to use in which scenario. Yes, Synapse does have its own visuals within the studio, so we'll have a quick look at that as well. And there are some Spark visualizations and some libraries that we'll look at. And actually the documentation, the Microsoft Learn documentation, is a single page that's really useful to go through for that. And lastly, the predict function within Synapse. So we've got a SQL function that can call models. So we'll look at what's supported, or what you need to understand what's supported when using that that function. So we'll jump in to integrating Power BI. Now, yes, you can integrate Power BI Workspace into Synapse Studio, and you can create multiple connections. So you can create multiple linked services to multiple Power BI workspaces. So in effect, you can work with Power BI within Synapse Analytics. And what you can do is you can work with both dedicated and serverless SQL pools. So you can create Power BI data sets using both of those SQL services. You do need desktop, so you can't author everything in Synapse Studio connected to Power BI. But you can create and edit the reports from the data sets within the studio. So it's important to know that yes, you will need desktop to be able to author the models once you're connected to either dedicated or serverless. So you can't edit and create those data sets within Synapse Studio itself, but you can create and edit reports. Now, in terms of the two SQL pools that we've got dedicated and we've got serverless. So on the dedicated side, this is about a service where you're actually importing data into its own storage. So almost think of it like an Azure SQL database or a SQL server. You are loading data into tables. Okay, now you're not going to worry about how the data gets loaded into the tables. You just need to understand that dedicated is about a data warehousing service where you'll have tables where data is imported at scale. So we're talking terabytes of data. Okay, that's what dedicated is for. Large scale data warehousing where the data is in the tables themselves. We have this concept of concurrency. So with dedicated, we have DWUs, which is the amount of compute that's given to dedicated. So you can scale up and scale down. But dedicated also supports functions like data masking and column level encryption. So again, some of the material around the DP-500 will go through what the options are in terms of data masking and column level encryption. On the serverless side, very different service. They're both SQL services, so they both work with the SQL syntax, except serverless, nothing to do with importing data into its own engine. It has no concept of storage other than the results that it's providing at query time. Okay, so no data is stored within serverless. It supports connecting to Azure Storage and Data Lake Gen 2 and Gen 1 as well, but DP-500 is predominantly around Gen 2. You can create SQL objects, so you can create external tables and views within serverless, but this is all to do with casting structure over the data that's external to serverless. So really, the choices between using dedicated or using serverless in Power BI is all to do with the scale of the data and where the data sits. So in terms of data that sits in data lakes, serverless is going to be, you know, the choice there. Whereas large scale data warehousing, let's say in a star schema or Kimball methodology, dedicated is where that data is going to be stored. So when we're querying data using serverless, okay, got some options there on the left hand side. We're using the open row set command. That's pretty much the fundamental command of serverless SQL pools that has the options to be able to connect to the data lake. So just from a learning perspective on serverless, as well as a certification perspective, understanding that open row set is absolute key. Yeah, so that's the sort of the crux of how serverless works. But we've got a couple of functions. Now I'm going to call out the file path function specifically. So it's a SQL function. And what this does, this actually enables you to partition prune. It enables you to go and search specific folders in the data lake. Okay, so you're not processing too much data. So the file path is probably one of the most essential SQL functions to understand in serverless SQL pools. We've got external tables and views, they're supported, and the way that serverless works in terms of a pricing tier is you're not being charged. You're being charged, sorry, for the amount of data that you're processing rather than any uptime or any size of compute, which is dedicated. Okay. And just to illustrate, we can read data from Azure storage accounts and Cosmos DB and the Dataverse. We can also write data back as well. So we've got the CTAS, the create external table as select statement. But bearing in mind that all of this data sits external to serverless and isn't imported into any form of storage format. Okay. But we can query complex data types. Okay, so in terms of JSON, so those three functions down there, JSON value, JSON query, and open JSON, okay, it's well worth you understanding what each of those does from a general perspective. So JSON value, we're looking at extracting single values, scalar values from data, whereas JSON query, we can look at and query arrays of data, and OpenJSON has functionality to explode, you know, multiple nested attributes within JSON into multiple tabular rows. So again, you know, worth having a look at those functions to understand what each of those does, but they're fairly straightforward in their in what outcome you'll get from those. But we've got Parquet, and Parquet also supports nested data types within itself, and it supports the same functions as querying JSON files. Okay, so you can use JSON value, JSON query, and open JSON with both JSON files, but also Parquet, because Parquet can have nested JSON data types within there as well, but they do the same thing. So there might be questions around querying Parquet data, but it's nested data types. So again, looking at those functions is particularly useful. So yes, we do have some visualization, some basic visualization aspects within Synapse Studio. Okay, now we can query data using SQL against either dedicated or serverless, and we get the same functionality. So we can create 6 types of visualizations at the moment, right? So as I said, it is pretty basic. So we've got area, bar, column, line, pie, and scatter. And to be honest, they don't even really support multiple axes. Okay, but worth understanding the chart, the chart options that are available. Very simple. Yeah, so just a few visualizations. So we do have the ability to change the chart type. We've got pretty much a single value that we can look on in terms of the legend, the measure that we want to create. But that's available within Synapse Studio. So we can look at the table of data, but we can also look at a chart as well. But we've got another way of visualizing data within Synapse, which is Spark notebooks. Now, this isn't specific to Synapse. This is available within the ecosystem of Python and Spark generally, but you'll be expected to understand how to import matplotlib libraries and understanding creating a data frame with data, using pandas with the data frame, and then creating some charts. Now, if like me, right, I'm not much of a Spark developer, that looks quite complicated, but the learn material is fairly comprehensive, and there's literally a one-pager on that to understand the basics of how to do that. So you're not going to have to understand how to load data frames. You'll just have to be able to understand some of the bits of code to get there. And yes, so we've got import matplotlib and seaborn and pandas have a little bit of a basic loading of a data frame, using pandas with that data frame, and then being able to plot. So when I took the DP-500 and Nikola can maybe cut in, but I did actually I had two questions on the charting aspects of this. So yes, well worth understanding the sort of multiple labels that need to be added in there as well, and ultimately providing a visualization. So importing libraries, data frame, pandas, and then the visualization. And then lastly will be the predict function. Okay, so it's a SQL function. Okay, it's within dedicated SQL pools, and it actually supports loading and scoring based on a machine learning model. So some things to call out that I remember from the exam as well. So at the moment, it only supports the Onyx runtime. Okay, so it can only load models that are in the Onyx format. You do have to declare, so like you would declare in a variable, you declare the model and actually load it into a variable which is of type var binary max. So it's probably the only time where you'd use max for a specific purpose. Okay, so I do specifically remember that being called out in terms of understanding the data type that uses the model. Okay, then from using a table of data or a view or a CTE, you then assign the data to score the model. So on the right hand side, bit of syntax. So as you can see, I'm declaring the model var binary max, and I'm selecting data, which is the function where I get the model, and I'm loading the model into a variable. Then I'm using a CTE, so with my prediction, so I've got customer ID, age, and a few other attributes that I want to push into my model. And then I've got the predict keyword where I'm giving it the model, I'm giving it the data, and I'm giving it the runtime, which at the moment is Onyx. So I think I'm going to hand back over for our last section, which is on external tools.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. That was magnificent. Thank you very much. So this is our last section, and it's related to external tools. So 3 of those tools that I sincerely hope if you're working with Power BI, nevertheless, if you're planning to take DP-500 or not, those 3 tools are must-have under your belts if you're working with Power BI. First thing first, before we proceed to explain how each of these tools can help you in Power BI day-to-day work, is to keep in mind that those tools are mostly free tools. In those 3 cases, the DAX Studio Tabulator version 2 and VertiPack Analyzer, they're free. But keep in mind that they are developed by third-party contributors. So they have one serious limitation. They are not officially supported by Microsoft. However, that doesn't or that shouldn't minimize their significance, especially for some common business workflows and common business scenarios where Power BI Desktop simply can't accomplish the task. So that's where these external tools may be the only choice that you have. Okay, so let's start with DAX Studio. That's a very comprehensive external tool. It's created by Darren Gosbell, guy from Australia who is now part of Power BI Microsoft customer advisory team. You can use DAX Studio to write DAX, to perform different kind of diagnoses, obtain query plans, understand the time that is spent within the VertiPack between formula engine and storage engine. You can troubleshoot DAX performance, format your DAX code, and many more different things. So this is really awesome tool that I would say deserves a separate 60-minute session just to talk about it. So let's move to Tabulator. Was created by your guy, Daniel Ottiker, guy from Denmark. And this is definitely a go-to tool for data modeling. Not just data modeling, but definitely for data modeling. It's not that it supports some of the most popular features, such as creating and managing calculation groups, setting object level security. So those are the things that can't be natively performed in Power BI Desktop. So you must use Tabular Editor or some other external tool that lets you manipulate tabular object model if you want to create objects such as calculation groups or object level security. Same applies for custom KPIs. One disclaimer here, there are 2 versions of Tabular Editor. Tabular Editor 2, which is a free version and can be downloaded from GitHub, both as standalone installation or as how to say, yeah, I lost the word. No, never mind. So you can download it from GitHub for free. And there is Tabular Editor 3, which is a commercial version of the product, and it provides many advanced features. In my humble opinion, Tabular Editor 3 is well worth investment that will pay off in the longer run. But for DP-500, you don't need Tabular Editor 3. Tabular Editor 2, this free version can be completely fine. It's portable version for download. Sorry, I lost this word. And finally, VertiPack Analyzer. So when you want to analyze and understand data storage structures inside the VertiPack, there is no better tool than VertiPack Analyzer. So what VertiPack Analyzer is doing, it collects data from various dynamic management views. So basically you can also use SQL Server Management Studio to perform same thing, but VertiPack Analyzer displays this data, this collected data, in much more convenient and I would say more user-friendly way. So it's especially useful when you need to determine the data model size, hierarchy size, relationship size, and so on, and to understand where there is a space maybe for some improvements in reducing data model size. VertiPack Analyzer can be used both as a separate tool, but it's more often it's used as part of DAX Studio. So it's part of DAX Studio, and once you download the DAX Studio, you will also get VertiPack Analyzer provided by default. As Andy mentioned in the beginning, those are learning resources where you can refer to find many more. Of course, we just scratched the surface, and you can find many more articles, videos, and stuff like that for preparing and for learning for DP-500. From my side, first of all, thanks Brian for hosting us. Thanks Andy It was a pleasure to join you for this session, and thank you to everyone for joining this session and staying a little bit longer with us.